I'm told this is an Apple Macintosh, so it's quite exciting.
Forward and backward arrows.
Apple McKenzie.
So what?
I'll be right here.
So all right, we'll try with the first slide. I need to apologise to various people here. I apologise for people who want a presentation with lots of pictures of equipment and diagrams of how fracking works, because this talk was originally part of a talk I gave last April-ish in Scotland, where I was really essentially just talking about the process which we'd been through at the public inquiry, which is actually quite interesting. It's rather a dry presentation because it really centres on the kind of arguments which Ed and myself and Mike Stigwood had to wrestle with, also against David Hiller from Arup, who he's not here, not here, who represented Quadrilla and the inquiry. So it's a little bit dry. It's quite interesting in terms of the inspector's decision, because despite spending the whole of the inquiry, at least my evidence anyway, staring straight ahead like this, she actually, I think, encapsulated all that I had to say in her decision, and all that Ed had to say. You might have a different take on it, but I thought it was an incredibly well-reasoned decision. We'll come to that right at the very end. I'd like to also apologise very much to Simon Stevenson, who's here tonight, who not only had to sit through my talk in Scotland, and he's got to sit through it again tonight, who knows a lot more about the whole fracking process than I do. So apologies, Simon. I don't think you're going to find anything else interesting tonight, but it'd be interesting for you to hear Ed's presentation. I did suggest that you gave this talk instead of me to the committee. So sorry about that. Maybe next time you got off lightly. So. Is the left-hand button, do you think?
I'd go right.
You go right.
Going forwards.
Okay, it's kind of logical. So, just to set the scene for the public inquiry, Lancashire County Council, who I was very honoured to be asked to represent. I think it went down with my, because most of you will know me as my other hat on, as a person who knows something about wind turbine noise. And I think I stressed our expertise on noise in rural areas quite strongly to Lancashire Council when we applied to assist them with this inquiry. So we were quite surprised to get the job. So Lancashire County Council received applications in 2014 for 2 shale gas exploration sites and 2 corresponding monitoring arrays. I'm not really going to talk, I'm not going to talk at all about the monitoring arrays, which is the way that the environment around the drilling area is monitored for possible seismic activity, because they did have some seismic events in Lancashire corresponding to some fracking work which was done. I'll explain what that actually means as we go through. But they were quite sensitive about the need for monitoring any seismic activity. But I'm only going to talk about the actual exploration, which includes drilling and pumping, and fracturing, of course, of the rock. What that comprises basically is construction of the site, so bringing all the equipment on to the site, making access tracks, making level ground, and all the kind of preparatory work you'd expect for a major construction project. Then the drilling operation, whereby a drill string goes down into the ground 4 or 5 kilometres before it turns a corner and goes horizontally along. And one of the things which we discovered a bit too late, was also thanks to Simon, who talked about this aspect of the drilling operation in Scotland at the talk I gave there, was that actually horizontal drilling makes considerably more noise than vertical drilling, which was what had been assessed as part of the preparation work for the evidence at this inquiry. Then there's the fracturing process, whereby the rock is fractured by high pressure water mixed with chemicals to extract the shale gas, which is stored in pockets within the rock. And then there's flow testing, where the mixture of oil and gas is brought back to the surface in trial runs, and then extended testing to make sure the whole process is working. And then in theory there is decommissioning and restoration to put the site back to where it was before anybody started drilling big holes in the ground and doing unspeakable things underground. So we had 2 application sites, one at Preston New Road, which for reasons that will become clear as we go through, I was employed by the council to give evidence on, And Mike Stigwood was employed by the objector group associated with this site. So you can see that here's Preston New Road here. Here's the site which is proposed for the drilling and the gas extraction. And these are the nearest cottages, nearest houses here along the side of the road. Okay, so there's a farm up here. There's some cottages here. This is where background noise measurements were made by Arabs in connection with these properties here, and there were measurements made there as well representing that property. The issue with this site is that although it's noisy during the day from passing traffic, it is quite a busy road. It's quite quiet at night, and Mike Stigwood helpfully did some measurements which enabled us to show the inspector at the inquiry just how quiet it got. And this was the site which the council hadn't objected to noise on, but which the objector group employed Ed to give evidence on noise issues at that site, which is actually probably the more sensitive of the two sites. I don't know if you'd agree with me, but with the more sensitive of the two sites because it is in a much more rural area, away from the main road, Preston New Road, which dominated the environment there. We have the site is in here, and then we have properties at Roseacre Farm, Stanley Farm, and Old Orchard Farm, and some measurements were carried out up here and down there by Harris. The measurements which were carried out were very brief. They were done over, I think it was a 1 day, 1 night period. So for something which had so much public interest, one of the things which all three of us made a big feature of was the fact that so little had been done in the way of background noise measurements to establish what the baseline noise level was. So this property, as well as being in a more rural area where it's quieter in the day, it's actually nearer to the M5 to the north. So there was a little bit more noise at night there, but it was very difficult to establish anything because there was so little which had been done in terms of establishing the baseline. So the main concerns, and this applies to both sites, was the fact that the drilling operation had to be carried out continuously because of the mechanics of the drill string, whereby sections of the drill are basically attached as the drill goes down through the ground, propelled by a top drive mounted on a kind of drilling derrick. New elements of the string have to keep being added in, and it's not possible once the drill is rotating to stop the drilling operation, because if you imagine that much amount of kind of slightly flexible material going into the ground, once you stop, you're pretty buggered if the thing stops operating. So the residents therefore were very concerned because there was likely to be continuous drilling initially for an 8-month period, which is essentially permanent drilling throughout the night, and then for 2 separate periods of 3 months each. So yes, 24/7 operation, noise at night, and the predicted level at the nearest housing in Preston New Road was 42 dB LEQ, and there's going to be a lot of talk about 42 as we go through. It's always very important in a noise discussion to talk about 42 a lot, and at Ed's site about 40. The predictions weren't done particularly comprehensively, I would say. I think we both agree that it was a bit that the report that was initially done by ART was more like a scoping report than a real noise assessment. I'm trying not to lay into them too much, but obviously these are the things that we discussed about as the inquiry went on. So they're not really super high levels of noise, nothing to really get your teeth into, but they're the sort of levels of noise which people are going to get particularly cross about if they're already upset about the whole fracking operation and the way that they perceive to have been trampled all over by the developer. They're going to get quite annoyed if they get that every night for an 8-month period. So we're not talking really massive levels, but we're talking about levels which are going to wind people up as things go on. And then we've got the fracturing operation, whereby there are some pretty massive pumps on the surface which are required to get the pressure of the fracking fluid up to the sort of level whereby it's going to make holes in the rock to allow the shale gas to come out. So that operation is noisier than the drilling, but it doesn't happen at night, and it happens for 3 hours per day for 4 2-month periods. So you've got a period of drilling, a period of fracturing, another period of drilling, another period of fracturing at 4 different well sites across the whole area, which is at each of the Preston New Road and the Roseacre Wood site. So daytime only,
quite noisy, about 55, but constrained to certain periods of the day. So, although it's not ideal, it was not really such a major concern. So, following the initial application, the Quadrilla, the developer, realised that they could reduce noise levels by about 3 dB after a bit of pressure had been put on them by the council, with the promise of a possible consent. They were, as normal, the developers were working with the planning authority to try and get things through and to show what they could do. And at Rosica Wood, following this reduction to 37 dB, the council officers had no objection on noise. I think quite reasonably in the circumstances. That's what they decided to do. And the reason for refusal at planning committee didn't include noise, but there were refusal on other grounds which led to the planning appeal process and the public inquiry, which we'll be moving on to. At Preston New Road, however, mitigation reduced predicted noise level to 39 dB, so a little bit higher for a noise level at night. And the council officers still had no objection on noise. They figured that the developers had done all they could to reduce the noise level to something which was somewhere along the lines of the sort of thing that the PPG the Planning Policy Guidance on Minerals, had in mind. But what happened was it went to a planning committee who were really revved up by Mike, of course, and they concluded that the development would cause unacceptable noise impact, resulting in a detrimental impact on the amenity of local residents, which could not be adequately controlled by condition. Blah blah blah. And local plans obviously get brought up. I'll show you what they say. Nothing particularly helpful. But I was the council. It made the council's job very difficult, as you could imagine. They'd recommended approval of the consent, went to the planning committee, who turned it down. So we went for a meeting with the planning committee, and myself and the guys from the council, and we talked to them about why they turned it down. What policy grounds have you turned this site down on? And they couldn't come up with them. They said, well, it's going to be noisy. It's going to be noisy at night, isn't it? The drilling's going to continue all night. I said, yeah, but that's fine, but we've got to have a reason to object at the public inquiry. We really need to get this right, because a claim for costs on the council was obviously looming at this point because of the fact they turned it down without any grounds in policy. So we didn't get any further with the planning committee because they really didn't know why they'd turned it down, and I suspect what they wanted to say, because Mike Stigwood suggested we probably ought to turn it down. So I'm not a big fan of planning committees. Apologies if there's anybody on the planning committee here. So the refusal on noise and other grounds as well, as per Rosica Wood, led to the planning appeal process and a public inquiry. These are the two policies it was turned down on, and I have helpfully highlighted the words, to save you reading all this, I've helpfully highlighted the words which refer to noise, essentially. Has to be demonstrated to the satisfaction of the Mineral and Waste Planning Authority, which is the county council, that all material, social, economic or environmental impacts that would cause demonstrable harm can be eliminated, and account be taken of the proposal setting based on environmental conditions, and then nothing much else to do with noise. But that's why it was turned down. Not much to get your teeth into here. And then filed local plan policy, unacceptable result in harm by way of noise pollution will not be permitted. But of course no reference here, as is normally the case with local plans and so forth, to any kind of national policy. So really not much to go on at all there. So we went to Blackpool Football Ground for a public inquiry, which is actually quite exciting. So I don't know where you stayed. I stayed. You probably stayed in somebody's. You probably stayed in a B&B if you were lucky. You know what? A camp.
In a out-of-season holiday camp.
Okay. I really pushed the boat out for my client because I think they wanted me to stay in the travel lodge across the road from the football ground. But I looked at the travel lodge's menu and I thought I really don't want to stay here. So I stayed in the football ground. And I got a whole meal, including lots of drinks, one night for free because they decided their service wasn't good enough. But it was kind of weird because going to public inquiries, you get used to staying in kind of slightly stuffy hotels with stuffy lawyers and so forth. And this was really weird because I'd be sitting there having my poached eggs on my own because all the council staff they lived locally, so they didn't stay in hotels. It was just me, and for a while the planning consultant as well, having our postings. And there were all these guys coming in with their tracksuits on and football bags over them because they're basically footballers, I suppose. Would you think? They probably were.
Would be.
Yeah. Okay. So we had this public inquiry, and it was all quite exciting. It went on for ages and ages. 6 weeks, was it? Quite incredible, really. The 6 weeks worth of because there were a lot of parties involved. The main issues at both sites were planning. So lots to talk about in terms of planning, landscape and visual assessment. Not much compared to a wind farm, I have to say. Pretty straightforward. Just one single drilling derrick and a bunch of containers stacked up to protect the residents from noise. Traffic, which was the major thing on Ed's site. Noise, obviously very exciting for everybody here, and there were various parties involved. It was difficult to keep track for a while. There was the appellant, a bunch of shifty looking guys, I would say. Lancashire County Council, obviously upstanding members of the community, very nice clients. There was Mike Stigwood's clients, the Preston New Road Action Group, represented by a very fancy lawyer who was very, very good. Rosica Wood Action Group, represented by another fancy lawyer from London, and their noise consultant, Mr. Clarke. Friends of the Earth, who had a lot of slightly unfocused things to say, I felt, about the whole scattergun approach. The North West Chamber of Commerce, what was that even about? So there was that. And so what I think was frustrating for the initially large and as we went on decreasing number of members of the public was that really the issues which were considered specifically excluded anything under the ground. It's a continuous source of frustration for me when I see my friends and stuff objecting about fracking on the internet and say, oh, this council permitted this site, it's a terrible kind of thing. The council can't do anything about it. The council isn't concerned with fracking. They are not able to turn the site down because they don't want fracking. They can only consider they can only consider planning issues, basically, because the issues under the ground are regulated by DEC and not DEC anymore, DBI, EIS, and the Environment Agency. They can only consider basically landscape and visual. There isn't very much, as I said. Noise, a little bit boring, not a whole lot going on. Traffic, well, traffic's an issue on small roads, and there's a lot of traffic going in, taking away all the sludge that this kind of process generates, and probably bringing in concrete and all kinds of stuff. But the stuff under the ground isn't a planning issue, and I think it's very frustrating for people who are trying to understand the planning process behind fracking sites that these things aren't addressed by the inquiry system or by the planning system. And the outcome, the inspector makes a recommendation, and that's referred to the Secretary of State because it's such a national important infrastructure thing. So not only was it taken out of the council's hands by the planning inquiry, something which is you often read, the press often talked about throughout the process, but even the inspector doesn't make a final decision. That's referred to the Secretary of State, who pretty obviously is going to say yes, this is fine, okay, because this is the government policy, and so they're not going to find against it. And rather bizarrely in this case, or maybe I should keep that till last. I'll keep that till last, but there's a twist in the tale. So anybody who's thinking of going for an early curry, it's worth staying till the end because there is a bit of a twist in the tale of this particular thing. Security was quite interesting because I stayed in the hotel. I didn't get frisked at the entrance like you presumably did, but I got frisked kind of on the landing when I progressed from the hotel area into the public inquiry area. There was some pretty heavy security. There were guys who with the special little tubey things from their ears, and with walkie-talkies, all checking as we walk backwards and forwards from the inquiry room to our offices. But nothing really happened. It was ever so dull. We thought it was going to be very exciting. There was going to be big protests, and even on the public day, there was a public evening or afternoon and evening session. And nothing happened, and the security were on high alert. It was all really exciting, but nothing happened at all. So there was some singing on the first day. In fact, that's all you could hear because it was all transmitted by a web feed. So it's probably not still there, but you could for a while go back and look at what you look like and feel really embarrassed and how you've got it all wrong. But the first day I was looking at that thinking that I've got to go here and do all this, and there was a lot of singing outside in the car park, but that was it really. Bit sad. Pardon?
The Blackpool fan, wasn't it?
No, I think that was the protesters. I think it was Blackpool. So okay. So let's get into the really interesting nitty gritty of the things we had to wrestle with and to help the inspector understand. We have the overreaching noise guidance, which consists of the National Planning Policy Framework, or the NPPF. We have the noise policy statement for England, documents which I'm sure you're all familiar with. We have more specific guidance on noise, because let's face it, they're not too specific on what we have to do. We have planning practice guidance on noise, which has got some useful information in it. We have the planning practice guidance on minerals, which is also actually for a government document is pretty prescriptive. We've got a bunch of other guidance. We've got BS 5228, and we had lots of debate on that with David, who represented David Hill, who represented Quadrilla, about how relevant BS 5228 was. We've got BS 4142, of course, because what public inquiry wouldn't be complete without people talking about BS 4142. And then we have the WHO guidelines for community noise and night noise guidelines for Europe. One of them published in, I think it was 1999, and one of them published in about 2009. And I actually managed to unearth the 2008 night noise guidelines for Europe, which is rather more beneficial to our case than the 2009 version, but I don't think the inspector really got to grips with the detail of it. So there are words in the National Planning Policy Frameworks, I'm sure you've read the fantastic 4 paragraphs of noise. Avoid noise from giving rise to significant adverse impacts, blah, 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 mitigate and reduce to a minimum other impacts, recognise the development will often create some noise, and then finally identify and protect areas of tranquility. And areas of tranquility don't probably apply to Preston New Road or even Rosica Wood, sadly, because nobody really knows what that last paragraph means, or do they? Maybe somebody has a view on it. We could maybe discuss that at the end. I have discussed it with Stephen Turner on many occasions. So the NPSE says avoid significant adverse impacts on health and quality of life, mitigate and minimise, where possible contribute to the improvement of health and quality in life. Tricky for Quadrilla, I think. And also introduces the no observed effect level, the lowest observed effect level, adverse effect level, the significant observed adverse effect level. So there was a bit of debate on where those things sit in relation to the levels of noise which are going to be generated by Quadrilla. And we have planning practice guidance on noise tells us what we have to do when we once we've worked out what those levels are. So below the no observed effect level, noise is not noticeable, there's no effect, no specific measures are required. Between NOEL and LOEL, noise could be heard but doesn't cause any change in behaviour or attitude, blah blah blah. No specific measures are required. Between that and that, I'm not even going to say them because I find it embarrassing, noise can be heard and cause small changes in behaviour with potential for some reported sleep disturbance. So you're seeing the kind of areas where we're saying, is it Lowell, is it Seoul, and you can see how the two sides might form a different opinion on how things are going to pan out in the area, because it says that noise should be mitigated and reduced to a minimum. So planning practice guidance on noise also introduced a new concept, which was the unacceptable adverse effect level, where there is regular sleep deprivation and awakening, and the circumstances should be prevented. So that kind of sets the scene in terms of overall guidance, but doesn't really tell us the kind of noise levels which we're trying to aim for. And at the end of the day, because there was it was so unlikely that it was going to get turned down by the Secretary of State. One of the things that I had to do was to get the level which was going to be recommended in the conditions down as low as possible. Ed's clients had a slightly different agenda. I also put forward, I thought, a very good case why it should be turned down on noise, but I didn't expect to get much success. So we have the fantastically prescriptive guidance on minerals, and our opposition tried to claim, rather incredibly, that this guidance didn't apply because it was a construction site and not really a minerals site, even though it was being determined by the Minerals Planning Authority, which I thought was a bit of a no-hoper, but I think he had a certain amount of pressure put on him by his clients. But anyway, this is if anybody has looked at this at all, this is quite straightforward. Daytime, 10 dB above background, or where that's difficult, then as near to that level as possible and not exceeding 55 dB anyway. Then in the evening, 10 dB above background and not exceeding 55 dB, and you're not allowed to kind of claim that it's an unreasonable burden to get it below that. And then at night, pretty obvious and straightforward, I think. Noise limits should be set to reduce to a minimum any adverse impacts without imposing unreasonable burdens on the mineral operator, subject to a maximum of 42 dB LEQ. And I think you can see where we're going with this. You can see where the principal arguments are going to be. How much of a burden, financially and in terms of practical operation, when does it become unreasonable? What is the kind of cost involved in what is an unreasonable cost in this concept? And the other argument was, does this mean 42 or does it mean something less than a 42? And there was some quite considerable, believe it or not, there was a lot of argument put forward about how that actually means 42, and all you can ignore all the first, 18 words before that 42 comes into play. And all these noise levels are free field, that's a bit dull. We have 5228, which is applicable for a site where there's significant outdoor excavation, levelling or deposition of material. So not really of use for this site. And of course we have the various categories of noise levels where background noise is low, and at night, which is the principal issue, background noise is low, but we didn't have any very comprehensive background noise data, so it was difficult to do anything other than look at the actual noise levels prescribed there. And then we've got BS 4142, which, as I said, is very important to have a little chat about BS 4142. But really, we didn't really focus on BS 4142. We thought that was a bit of a no-brainer for this reason, which is that it's not applicable for other sources falling within the scope of the standards and guidance. And it's very, very comprehensively covered by the PPG on minerals. We have the WHO guidelines for community noise, with the levels which we're probably familiar with. Serious noise during the daytime occurs above 55, moderate noise during the daytime and evening occurs above 50, and sleep disturbance should be restricted to below 45, which may be a facade level, maybe a free field level. It's all open to a bit of debate. And then finally, the night noise guidelines for Europe, which we did talk about in some detail, which goes really out on a limb and says that 40 dB L night outside is the lowest observed adverse effect level. So clearly I had some things to say about this. Yes, that's all to do with transport noise, all very fine, but actually if you're lying in bed and you can't get to sleep because you're so pissed off about the drilling from across the road, it's not really going to be the lowest observed adverse effect level, because you're going to be pretty tense about the whole thing. So that was one of my points I tried to get across to the inspector. I'm not sure how much he took on board, but I think I made my position fairly clear on that, or at least the council's position, should we say. So the main areas of debate then were the interpretation of the assessment guidance, and you've got a bit of a flavour for where that was going. Basically, is BS 5228 relevant to shale gas drilling and fracturing? In PPGM, what constitutes an unreasonable burden? And I've put UB in there so that I can refer to it later without writing it out. Also, in PPGM, what is background noise? This is something that we've been struggling with for about 25 years now, ever since we had logging sound level meters, which allowed us to look at the variation in background noise throughout a 3-month period, if you will. There's very little on a definition of background noise. Background noise used to be what you went out and measured in the middle of the night in a 10-minute period and then went home again. It's very different to that now. We know exactly how the background noise varies day and night, with wind, and wind direction and wind speed and many other factors. So given the lack of definition of background noise, that's quite a difficult approach. In its defence, and I don't have a lot of defence for BS4142, BS4142 does at least now try to define what background noise is. And then, of course, what are the values for all these things, which I'm not going to say, and are they consistent with other guidance, where the other guidance might have been applied for things like construction projects or transportation, and how relevant is sleep disturbance based on transport sources in this case, and what is the nature of the disturbance? Are there any particular sensitivities of nearby residents relevant? There's always somebody who's on the autistic spectrum near any development site, so those kind of things tend to be argued about. And how are those limits? How do they compare with other sites in Lancashire where planning permission has been given? And so I've already kind of touched on that one, so I won't labour that again. I'm sure Ed wants to say something, so I'm not trying not to go on too long. So that was the areas of the debate to do with the planning arguments, if you will. Then there was the more technical noise arguments. There was the predicted source noise levels. Sorry, the predicted noise levels. Where did they come from? How were they done? Of course, first of all, we've got the establishment of the source noise levels, the LWA, if you will, of all the equipment all summed together, all making a noise. And how was that deduced in order to carry out the noise predictions? What will be the effect of using different equipment to that modelled in the EAS? How sure could we be that what was modelled in the EAS would be actually what was used on the site? Absolutely no confidence at all. Probably about the same, but that was one of the things that we needed to put our minds to. And what about propagation effects? How were they modelled? And the uncertainty in the predicted noise levels. ISO 9613 is all very fine, but how do you know that what it produces is going to be the answer? There is a little bit of uncertainty in the standard, which says you should apply various uncertainty figures to your results. Quadrilla certainly weren't interested in that, and sadly the inspector said some, I thought, fairly unhelpful things where she said, you don't need to worry about that, Dr. McKenzie, or something along those lines. Then we've got noise character, tonal character from the drilling, which was claimed to be non-significant, and impulsive content in the noise, and any low frequency content. And then what might be instantaneous maximum noise levels, and how we're going to protect residents against that. And we debated what was going to go into the planning conditions, what the actual daytime and nighttime limits should be to be applied to each site. Should there be a separate evening and weekend noise limit? Where would the monitoring equipment be located? Because the council had promised all sorts of things to the locals in terms of monitoring, which they really weren't able to deliver, because you imagine the possibility of monitoring whether a level of 40 dB or 42 dB was being exceeded at a property which is exposed to probably about 50 or 55 every time a car goes past. They had fairly unrealistic expectations of what they were going to be able to do. As a result of that, there was a need for constant audio recording, which had also been promised, and how to eliminate tonal and impulsive content without making the requirements unreasonable. So if you've got if you're having a condition which says there should be no tonal or impulsive components in the noise, that's unreasonable if it applies to noise levels which are of the order of 20-25 dBA, for obvious reasons, because it just becomes so unreasonable. So the final council position at the inquiry was that the relevant guidance was the minerals PPG, quite reasonably. The daytime limit of 55 dB LEQ is acceptable in the absence of comprehensive baseline data, which we just didn't have, and the council hadn't gone out and done any measurements, and it was too late by the time I got involved. The nighttime limit of 42 dB LEQ is not appropriate because Quadrilla had already demonstrated that they could reduce the noise level by 3 dB at both sites in order to try and get the planning consent through. So they said they could do this, which they then retracted and said, no, actually, now we're at inquiry, we're not going to do that. We think 42 dB is acceptable. So our position was that meeting a limit lower than that shouldn't constitute an unreasonable burden, given that they'd already demonstrated the ability to meet that lower limit with mitigation. 42 dB was effectively the significant observed adverse effect level for minerals because of the provisions, the exact provisions of PPGM. We don't know what the lowest observed adverse effect level, but when pushed by the inspector, I said it was probably about 35. We could take if we had that special thing, we could raise our numbers up, we could raise our hands up, couldn't we, with numbers on saying what we thought the lowest observed adverse effect level in a rural area might be. And that Quadrilla should revisit the site design and equipment spec to comply with a lower limit. And Ed's going to talk a little bit more about the mechanics of that, as well about the joys of working for his clients. And we'd also need to take account of the uncertainty in the predicted noise levels to ensure that the limits could be met in practice. So we agreed that the tonal impulsive content could be controlled, and there was no need for specific low frequency consideration. So planning conditions, daytime limit of 55 agreed between the two parties. I can't remember if you agreed with that. Probably good, excellent. Nighttime limit of 37 dB proposed by the council for both sites for consistency reasons. So we said, okay, you've shown you can meet 39, but actually you've shown you can meet 37 at Rosica Wood. We think it's got to be consistent, so we're going to propose that as a limit. There was no separate evening time limit, but the nighttime limit was agreed to apply from 9 o'clock at night. So that was kind of compromise, really. It seemed to work for everybody. And we supported the proposal by Mike's group to a separate weekend daytime limit of 45 rather than 55. Permanent monitoring was going to be carried out at an agreed location with online access to the data, audio recording to be triggered at a value to be agreed with the council. And tonal and impulsive content would only be restricted for steady state noise level above 30 dBA. Yes, and how to actually do the noise monitoring was going to go into a separate agreement, kind of postponing the difficulty of what we're going to do until a later date. And so I'm going to stop now before you're all sick of me and hand over to Ed for some interesting things.
Thanks for the challenge.
You could probably move me out of the way and then just, yeah.
I can just bring you back again at the end. There we go. So my perspective on this whole thing, the idea is that Andy's given you quite a lot of detail on the sort of the planning of the planning case of the whole thing and the mechanics of it. What I'm kind of bringing to you are the perspective of working for a residents' action group, which was interesting, and their case, I guess. Yes, we had this public inquiry at Blackpool FC, which is, as Andy said, it's a really exciting place to be.
My bedroom window, that is.
It's remarkably similar to the Miami Orange Bowl, I think. I think you'll find it's not at all. It's relevant this week. And I was working for the Rosica Awareness Group. I think they changed it from Action Group to Awareness Group partway through the proceeding. Well, my involvement, because it's all about awareness and they're not yet going to be chaining themselves to anything, I guess. And their perspective, which is that Quadrilla are the evil, nasty people who are going to blow their houses up with shale gas. And as Andy said, this whole ambiguity about the process, or not even ambiguity, but the misunderstanding people have about the process as to how there's nothing to do with the actual fracturing process is relevant to the planning case. Perspective. It was a refreshing angle to come at this from. My client, I'm going to just call them RAG. They're the Rosica Awareness Group with the local parish council and all of those guys. So it was an interesting deviation, if you like, departure for us. The working alongside Andy and Mike Stigwood. Mike's not here, is he?
I haven't seen him yet.
I haven't got anything nasty about Mike in the presentation, just that tone. who is representing the Preston New Road Action Group, and Andy for Lancashire County Council. And we brought sort of our engineering pragmatism and our recent petrochemical experience to the party as well, to the aid of the pressure group, which was kind of an interesting spin on things. So objectors as clients is kind of interesting. We don't have any particular axe to grind. We're not pro or anti fracking or making the world a quieter or less fracking place. We have historically done more work for developers on large infrastructure or petrochemical projects than any for action groups, whether that's to do with the resources they have available or the circles we've moved in more recently. I don't know, but I think we see ourselves, rather than being advocates for one side of any of these debates or another, we're more translators. We speak the mystical language of the decibel, and we're trying to while doing so on behalf of a particular client, do it in a suitably impartial way. So it was a good opportunity for us to demonstrate that independence, I guess, and to get a handle on this other side of things. I'm kind of squinting at this. These notes pages come out incredibly small, and I can't read them on there either, so I'll kind of make some of it up anyway. The reasons, yeah, that's what I just said. So our appointment, the Roscoe Awareness Group, we were recommended to them, in fact, by the Noise Abatement Society, by our friends at NAS. And they were deciding between going with us and also using MAS Environmental, Mike Stigwood, who was representing the other site. And it was a case of, I think eventually when the two residents groups discussed the thing with each other, they thought that actually it's a rather complementary relationship to have what we would perhaps apply as a bigger picture, more holistic approach to the issue, as opposed to Mike Stigwood's very specific, possibly verging on pedantic, analytical, minutiae approach.
I think we're a good team.
Yeah, I thought it brought a lot of elements together very usefully, and I think that's something that the just picking up on the point Andy made earlier about how the inspector really captured all of the arguments. I think part of what helped with that is the way the programme officer asked for all of our evidence in MS Word format before the end of the appeal.
Okay.
I think there might have been a certain amount of cut and paste, but to her credit, it sort of read quite well. So she obviously understood it while she was doing it. And then, yeah, practicalities and arrangements. What was I going to say about that? I guess just in terms of appointment, unlike when we're working for a large developer and there's a case of, well, go ahead and do whatever you need to do. We're committed to a public inquiry now. Tell us your hourly rate, your day rate, whatever it is, and just get on with it. Obviously, these guys are constrained budgetarily, so we had to do it in a very piecemeal way. So we had to have a look at the evidence and give them a bite-sized fee for seeing if there was a case to answer, put together a scope, fee for a meeting here, fee for a con with a barrister there, and even representation at the inquiry was very constrained to me only being there when I absolutely needed to be, and that was helped massively by the live stream webcast. So I was able to sit in the office and listen to and watch the other noise experts giving evidence. I could have that playing in the background while I was doing something else if they were rambling on a bit. Not you. But that was very helpful, and it enabled me to then show up, give evidence myself, and refer to something that Andy had said the previous Tuesday, really categorically, because I had kind of been there, rather than just reading it from some transcript and it not being quite right. So that was really useful. I think we were concerned initially with our first meetings with with the residents about how it was going to work procedurally. It wasn't a problem, actually, it was fine. Their planning consultant kind of led the way organisation-wise, and all the tactical elements of it were dealt with very capably by two pretty good barristers. So that all worked, and I didn't have anything really to be concerned about with that. The final point was feedback. I mean, don't know about everyone else's experience, but we tend to work with a team of very professional people in a very English, uptight way, and discussing how things went afterwards. Well, you wouldn't possibly want to be overly bullish about it, because you probably won't win, and it's a very sort of low-key kind of a thing. Whereas with this, my client was slapping me on the back, and everyone was buying me drinks afterwards. I'm not sure what my performance quite warranted that, but they were quite upbeat about the whole thing, which was quite refreshing. So that's clients as objectors as clients. Then working with Hayes McKenzie and with MAS Environmental. In fact, the inspector said at one point that we've heard from four noise experts now and had 4 different opinions on which is the relevant assessment standard. That's always going to happen. That's the point, and that's why it was quite useful to have that difference of perspective, I think. It didn't really mean that 3 of us were ganged up against David Hiller so much. I think one thing that Quadrilla had going for them is that certainly their argument was all unified because there was only one of it, whereas there were differences of perspective. To be honest, from my clients' expectations, and I think that's the biggest area that I had to be very careful about, was that it was quite apparent that although my role is to present noise evidence and if something's too noisy, explain why and how it might be quieter, my client had no interest in me explaining how to make the thing work more quietly, and they just wanted it not to happen. And making it just not happen isn't really my job. So it's quite a tricky one to balance out in terms of giving that evidence. So this is... It's really clumsy, isn't it? In situ. No one proofread this. I can only apologise. So I think what we tried to big up a little bit, if I'm being honest, but what was useful for us to bring to the party was this background in pragmatic, making things work, engineering, roll your sleeves up and make it quiet enough noise control, rather than just naysaying and goodness me, that's too loud, you can't possibly do it. And that's that conflict I was just referring to in terms of what our client was trying to do. But I think it read quite well in terms of then presenting evidence to the inspector that was balanced and appropriate. And it gave us this sort of the ability to look at what Arup had been describing from Quadrilla's proposals in a sort of a peer review. I'm not sure I would have done it quite that way, kind of a tack, rather than kind of tack, not attack, tack, rather than just naysaying it. So I think that was helpful. It enabled us to identify specific things that we thought might have been done in a different way, and as I say, I think it was the right balance in terms of providing that level of said balance 3 times in a row, but balance. There you go. So I thought that's kind of our perspective on working for the residents. I'm just going to talk a bit about RAG. I'm calling it RAG. Like you don't like saying Knowles and Souls, but the RAG's case basically can be summed up like this. The noise impact of the scheme is understated. We weren't impressed by the level of noise control and the comprehensiveness of it. I think a sort of a scoping type of an assessment was what Andy was describing earlier. A lot of our criticisms of Arup Acoustics' work weren't criticisms of their work, it was criticisms of the question that they'd been asked by their client, I think. And it's more a, how did we get to this position kind of a criticism, rather than that calculation is wrong. See what I mean? So the noise impact of the scheme is understated. And that also comes back to the selection of the assessment methodology, which may or may not have been appropriate. Adequate noise control measures have not been proposed, exactly what I said about this sort of scoping type of assessment. And quite a killer blow that I kept referring to whenever I could in my evidence was that the Rossiter Wood site is more noise sensitive than the lead case at Preston New Road. And there are a number of lines of other people's evidence that I kept coming back to that said that in other people's words, so it's quite convenient. So just expanding a little on each of those. The background noise conditions weren't effectively quantified. Andy mentioned that, just picking up on it. Arups did a survey one night when it was quiet for a bit. Jacobs were employed initially by Lancashire to go back and do a bit of a due diligence on Arups' work. And they did the same thing, and they went back and said, yeah, it's about that, it's about the same. Again, it's about the question they were asked, because in the context of pre-selecting BS 5228 as the correct assessment method for the minerals extraction site, but the construction by drilling of it didn't make any sense, but that was the almost pre-selected assessment methodology. All they were going to do was establish if, in the middle of the night, was it less than 45 or not? Because if it is, then we need to make it quieter than that. And it's not a definition of what the quietest or the typical ambient or background conditions are, it's just, is it less than 45? So answering that question, they did it fine. It wasn't the right question to have been asking them to answer. The impact was assessed in absolute terms rather than in comparison with the background for exactly the same reason. And so we didn't have an indication of just how annoying at night this fracking noise is going to be. So drilling noise at night. And the applicant used the wrong assessment methods, as discussed. I'm going to slightly disagree with what Andy was just saying earlier. We're kind of going straight back to exactly what I was giving evidence on at the inquiry. So this logic puzzle with BS 4142, I think it's patently obvious that 5228 can't be the right standard to use. It's not a construction site, it's an oil drilly thing. It's extracting minerals. PPGM must be the correct standard to use. PPG minerals very clearly directs us to compare noise impact with background levels. It's only about 3 paragraphs long in terms of the noise element of PPG minerals, but in those paragraphs it's quite clear that that's what we should be doing, but it doesn't give us any guidance, Andy mentioned, on how to compare minerals extraction noise with background noise levels. How do we compare stuff with background noise levels? We use BS 4142. It's BS 4142's specialist subject. So it's the go-to way of making that comparison. 4142 describes how to quantify background, how to rate things against background. Other elements of 4142, the joint Nordic method definition of tonality, for example, were accepted by the developer as being the way to look at whether it's tonal or not. So obviously there are bits of 4142 that we can adopt. And there is just this clause that was highlighted in Andy's slide, 1.3h, which says, standards not intended to be applied to the rating and assessment of sound from other sources falling within the scope of other standards and guidance. And my point here is simply that it's not covered by PPG minerals because it doesn't tell us how to do it. So this is all about guidance treading on the toes of other guidance. And there's nothing in 4142 that overlaps with PPG minerals in terms of them contradicting one another. So it provides us with a way of defining tonality using the joint Nordic method, and it provides us with these ways of defining background noise and comparing levels with them. So that was, without going through the whole thing again, that was what I was saying at the inquiry, that 4142 should be what we're using to compare with background and come to the conclusion that background noise levels are way lower than 45, they're closer to 30 in the middle of the night or less. So something which is up around 40 in the middle of the night is going to be a significant impact. And that just wasn't highlighted by any of the assessment work that had been done by the applicant. And then we come to, if we're going to get into these thresholds and the toxicology terminology, this is something that I had in my evidence, just setting out where are we at with these relatively low, admittedly, levels in the middle of the night. And we pluck out little bits from various editions of WHO as we find them to be convenient at the time. But there's some consistency within all of those documents which says, don't even look at it below 30, to be honest. Anyone, even Mike Stigwood, suggesting that we should, is fighting a very uphill battle. It's very quiet. There's an estimated complaint threshold by the WHO, 5 dB higher than that at 35. 37, as we heard, is the mitigation standard previously agreed by Quadrilla. 40 is the sort of generic Lowell we get out of WHO. 42 we could pluck from PPG Minerals, which is it the Sol, is it the Ewell even, because you mustn't allow anything above 42 at night. I share Andy's scepticism with some of these definitions. And then 45 is our BS 5228 limit for temporary construction noise at night, which is conveniently the highest of all of those levels, and the one that Quadrilla went straight in at as the only one that made any sense to them. So that was where we sit relative to those numbers. At the risk of entering into audience participation at this stage of the evening, if I ask you what is the answer to life, the universe, and everything? You don't even need a clue, do you? It's not. It can't possibly always be 42. The answer to make it quiet, but never more than 42, isn't always 42. And the wording of the PPG Minerals wouldn't make any sense if that were the case. And we go to the section Andy had up previously. Noise limits should be set to reduce to a minimum any adverse impacts without imposing unreasonable burdens on the mineral operator, subject to a maximum of 42. It can't always be 42. And that's the fundamental point that was quite frustrating
It was a bit weird.
to hear undermined, I think, because it seems so apparent. Yeah. So, what else was in the case? Well, we'd heard this thing about previous submissions. Quadrilla had already worked out that they could get down to 37. Now, whether they wanted to commit to it or not, or whether they wanted to be conditioned to it, or whether they wanted to spend the extra 1.46 million per site, which, without them then telling us how much they were going to make out of each site, or how much the whole thing cost, didn't really mean anything. It's just a kind of random number. But it was obviously possible. So how can we say that? Well, forget it. Back to 42, because the answer is always 42. Doesn't seem right. The noise mitigation that was proposed, this kind of scoping stage mitigation, was a bit ad hoc and a bit bolted on, and picking up on the planning policy for good design. My submission was that the submissions didn't demonstrate good acoustic design, which is a bit of a buzzword going around, buzz phrase going around at the moment, because it hadn't gone through the right process. And there's a good acoustic design. My view of what would constitute good acoustic design for this kind of scheme. The process itself needs to be looked at from the very outset, is top drilling the right way of doing what they need to do? Can they use a turntable drive system? Can they look at the pump types? I've seen all kinds of different types of pump, some of them incredibly noisy, for this type of application. All of these things ought to have been demonstrated, to have been thought through from the outset, rather than here's the thing we're doing, now make it quiet. And that was very much the model. It was Quadrilla had another site that they used as a reference comparator. That's what we're going to do. Measure how noisy that is. We'll be doing that over there. How big a fence do we need? So they should have gone through plant selection. So they got the quietest models for all of these pumps and bits of kit. Reselect quieter plant is a bit of a mantra at CSA, and I'm thinking, and it should have been part of the process. The physical arrangement of the spread, the layout, where they put the various things, the directivity of the plant. That there was a bit of a retrospective justification in the ARUP assessment, saying that it was configured in that arrangement because of the noise control, but it kind of looked awfully like what they were going to do anyway. Then proven noise control accessories, the bolt-on bits of shrouds and hoods and things that you can get for kit that the manufacturer makes and they test in their factory and they know what they do. Then maybe close-up containment. You've got a hit list of where the noisiest things are, and you put a close-up screen around something because it's particularly noisy. And then finally, F, you might eventually get to site barrier screening as okay, well, we've done everything else. Do we need a big fence up or not? The first port of call in terms of noise control can't be how big do we build barrier. We've seen recently just how high does the wall have to be isn't really the answer to all our questions, and we can do better. We can be more elegant than that, I would suggest. So then finally there was this rather easy goal at Blackpool FC for me to keep scoring, which was that it was accepted within the evidence of others, including the write-up in the two comparative environmental impact assessments for the two sites by the applicant, that there was a summary table which described Rossiter Wood as very quiet at night and quite noise sensitive, and Preston New Road didn't have that phrase in it. So and whatever you think, Madam Inspector, whatever you reckon about what Mike Stigwood's done with his extended background noise survey and the minutiae he's gone into, just like that, but more so for this site. So you know, it was quite convenient from our point of view there. And yeah, just I don't know. I can't read about how well the process had gone, and how good it was working with that. It was marvellous. But what we all want to know is what happened next.
Oh, right, is it my bit again now? What the hell is that?
That's what happened next, folks.
Are you really ready for me to...
Yeah, go on. I was ages too, like 25 minutes.
Right, I won't detain you too much longer. But I know you're all riveted. Anybody who hasn't read the decision is riveted to know how it all panned out, aren't you?
Oh, from the start. I've got to go from the start.
No,
That's all right.
Is it a Mac thing, is it?
No, it's a close your fingers thing.
Oh. The outcome.
That's it. From current slide. That was a button you said. The outcome. There you are.
So I think so. The inspector made her recommendations in about July, and then I think it was in about September, October. We got the and it was a bit weird because David Hiller was due to give a presentation to the Southern branch about it, and the decision came out about 4 days before he was due to give his presentation, and then mysteriously the event was cancelled. So I've discovered this thing, Bitly. Has anybody know what Bitly is? It's a thing where you can compress enormously long links down to a very, very small thing. So originally it said I couldn't fit the link in because it went off about 3 lines and it said see link, but I've actually done this thing whereby you can go there and you can find a link to the clicking on that will take you right to the inspector's recommendations and the final decision. If anybody wants to write it down, or you can ask me for it and I can send it to you. Basically, the inspector's recommendations, and we're not going to talk about the monitoring sites because that's just a bit dull, was that Preston New Road was allowed and that Rosica Wood should be dismissed. That's the recommendations. So at that point, Ed's team kind of won, but they didn't know they'd won because they hadn't seen the inspector's recommendations before they saw the Secretary of State's report. So, and the overall, the inspector reached these overall conclusions on noise at night. She said, and I thought this was great for our case, that PPGM does not support 42 dB LAEQ as the lowest observed adverse effect level. Woohoo! So that was very good. She said that the case specifics supported a reduction below 40 dB LEQ, and I'm kind of paraphrasing from the almost quoting word for word, but not because I couldn't have fitted it all into my slide. The lowest achievable value without an unreasonable burden is 39 dB at Preston dB LEQ at Preston New Road and 37 at Rosica Wood. Basically, what they'd said a year before when they were trying to get the planning consent before they got a little bit bullish because they were going to public inquiry. But in our favour, to our glory, she said that 39 and 37 would not entirely eliminate all adverse effects, but would be acceptable and prevent significant effects. So that was her take on kind of in line with policy. That was what she decided. And I think that was a fairly reasonable interpretation of our evidence. And she agreed that a later starting time for fracturing on Saturdays would be appropriate, 9 o'clock, but not to apply a lower limit for evenings and weekend. She made some other observations which were quite helpful, because I think this is one of the things we kind of agreed on, I think, under her questioning, because she was obviously had a certain focus on some things. She said that she considered 35 dB LEQ is likely to represent, and this is quoting, likely to represent the lowest point at which observed adverse effects as defined by PPGN would occur. And I think that was quite a good thing. Mike was arguing for 30 or probably lower, but I think that realistically this was what Ed and I both felt was appropriate. And I think that this was another a particularly telling thing. Evidence has not shown that reduction of night noise by 3 dB requires anything complex or out of the ordinary. Estimate of 1.46 million per site is all but meaningless. Again, great. So, unfortunately, I felt that she dismissed the uncertainty arguments about the inability to meet the noise limits, because I felt that they were so close to the limits with their predictions, with their massive shroud all around the whole drilling rig, costing 1.46 million. I felt that they could still be 3 dB with a following wind, a downwind, any kind of wind you want, but there was a significant chance they wouldn't be able to achieve those levels because of the uncertainty factors in ISO 9613 which they used. She agreed a 55 dB LEQ daytime limit, which I don't think we had a particular issue with that. It would have been helpful if we'd had some more baseline information, but we didn't. And she agreed a 30 dB threshold for acoustic feature assessment, which I think that Quadrilla were a little bit adverse to. The Secretary of State's decision, she agreed with some caveats which aren't really particularly interesting with the inspector on Preston New Road. She agreed with the inspector on Rosica Wood, but she said, well, it's a bit of a shame for Quadrilla. I think I might give them a second chance. Which is, I just felt that was unusual for an appeal decision to say, well, we'll let them have another go if they can just come back and just address these. So in the wind farm world, that doesn't happen. You're out. It's gone. Dead. Unless you're going to take it to the High Court. So, I don't know if you'll be brought back in and what's going to happen, but we don't know. All I know that is I've been asked to comment on, provide comments on the proposed noise management plan and noise monitoring methodology for Preston New Road as required by the conditions. One of the conditions they had to supply this, so of course they supplied it, I reviewed it, I said send it back, and I haven't had any more. So we'll see. Thank you very much for your patience in sitting through 2 ginormous presentations, to the committee for inviting myself and Ed, and to all of you for listening with such great patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you both. We have the room till around about 8 o'clock, so we have a few minutes to questions, if that's okay. If you'd like to speak up, and if you want to just say who you are before you ask your question.
I'm Conor Tickler from Acon. We've now got the monitoring contract with Preston New Road, so that's all interesting. But we're
From Quadrilla.
Sorry?
From Quadrilla.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So we'll be hearing from you, I'm sure.
Yes. I was interested. You've got a small question and a slightly bigger question. The 37, 39 were predicted to be achievable at each location.
Yeah.
Were they based on similar distances, or were they based on a completely different distance between the rigs?
No, there was just Rosica Wood, the nearest residences were further away.
Okay, right. So I just wondered, you were talking, sort of seemed to suggest that 37 might be applicable at Preston New Road.
Yeah.
And so.
I felt that there should be some consistency.
Okay. The other question was, if you were working on behalf of Quadrilla, for example, would there be any arguments you would have made, or anything you would have done differently than was done in the appeal?
It's about the question you're asked again, I suppose, isn't it? And responding appropriately. I find it strangely schizophrenic when representing a party in an adversarial case like this, because we're not slanting evidence, but we're providing evidence which is in response to a specific position and case. So I think, yes, if I would have presented different evidence for Quadrilla, I don't think I would have supported 5228 as the right standard to use for the assessment. I don't think it was in their interests to try and run that argument anyway, because it made them look silly. So I think the bulk of my opinion wouldn't change. You'd just put it in a slightly different way, I guess.
Yeah, I think I would have looked for more detail in the prediction methodology and the predictions, including the source noise levels which we use. I would have no chance of me arguing for 42 dB. I felt very sorry for David Hiller. I think he felt very uncomfortable, in fact. It was a ridiculous line for them to take, and just as Ed said, made him look silly. I would have looked for a lot more comprehensive background noise measurements around the site, especially if I wanted to justify a higher level. It wouldn't have helped, but I think I would have still have gone for it, just because it was a highly public case, and it just looked ridiculous to go out and do measurements for one night. Yeah, I think they're the main things. I would have probably tackled it exactly the same way if I'd been working for the other side. Again, slightly slanted, slightly differently, probably, but I think I would have no way of defended a 42 dB level, because it just flies in the face of policy.
I think the only way you could have defended it would have been by comparison with, by actually describing the site as being relatively noisy. In fact, it's not far from the M55. Neither of them are. Preston New Road. You'd need to set the whole thing in a different context. I managed to get away with saying to a room full of people from Blackpool that the M55 didn't really go anywhere. It's not like one of these motorways that goes around London or something, where there's something going on all night, and it's very quiet in the middle of the night.
I think I was saying that.
Yeah. But
it's good money.
It was, but it is next to a motorway. Yours is next to a busy main road. They're not tranquil places. And I think an argument to try and get as close to the upper limit of 42 as you could would have been based around how, putting it all in the context of the dynamic noise climate. I think I'd have tried.
No.
Neil Jarman.
I am.
Paul Jarman. given that the eventual noise limit for Preston New Road was 39, which was what was being offered by them in the first place, was there a sense of relief that costs weren't awarded against the council?
Oh, absolutely. I think my job was to really defend the planning committee's decision and so avoid an application for costs. And that was really my because we knew it wasn't going to get, you know, try as I might, I wasn't going to convince the inspector that it was going to be the noise effects were going to be so significant as to make it impossible to give a consent on noise grounds. So really that was the principal thing for the council, was avoiding a costs award, because it would have bankrupted them, because they were already almost bankrupted by the whole thing anyway.
Roger Mumms, you say anything about the relative importance of the tonal, impulsive and low frequency aspects of this study?
Yeah.
Which was the most dominant of those things, or were they?
There are conditions that I still wasn't happy with at the end of the process of wording the draft conditions in relation to impulsivity, because it wasn't really fully tackling impulsivity, but at least it did address some LMAX events, I guess was more what that was targeting, precluding any tonality as defined by the joint Nordic method at levels above 30 dBA. I think is actually quite onerous on Quadrilla, and they'll struggle to achieve that. I think that the tonality is the biggest thing, I think, for that drilling operation at night, and the potential for the thing to start to screech and make horrible noises, and that's something that the monitoring exercise is going to be watched very carefully, I guess, by all the residents, with live access to the data, which is one of the requirements.
What was the fracking an impulsive thing, or was that totally?
Well, the fracking's daytime only.
Yeah.
And the data from the comparison site had some noise features, I seem to recall, that were again, it was lost in the morass of trying to get some of these points across to the inspector, but impulsivity versus occasional noise events. The actual rise time, the crest factor of the data wasn't really something we resolved to my satisfaction.
I'd go along with that. I think the tonal issue is going to be a problem, especially when the drill turns the corner and it starts having to drive the drill along that way by turning it that way. That's when problems are going to arise. And I don't think Harrop had fully taken that on board when they did the assessment and agreed to a no tones condition.
The seismic aspects of it, you say that's wasn't part of the
Not really.
Low frequency didn't seem to be an issue.
Okay, would be for some people probably.
No, in terms of generation.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
Max Davis. Quick question, how many of you guys have actually been out and measured a drilling rig before the inquiry?
He had, I hadn't.
Did you look at sort of previous rigs that have been going on, that have been active in the country? Because we've been working for 15 years probably on this.
And well, there was also a lot of data submitted to the inquiry. Some was it Sharps Redmore had done the comparison site survey? No, Spectrum Acoustics. Spectrum. So there's a lot of data out there.
Noise is really a minor issue. Do you accept that your issue comes to the
As a noise consultant, it's my only issue. So it's
because of the way it was, because of the way the planning for these kind of sites is dealt with, they are fairly minor issues and fairly peripheral, but it's the only... It's like talking about ground noise from airports. It's so peripheral compared to what goes on in the sky, but yet people can fight over the terms of ground noise at an airport, but they can't fight over the terms of the air noise. So that's what they'll fight over, and that's what happened here.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Whether or not it should go on to appeal or not is neither here nor there. Should the planning committee have turned it down? Because on a planning, purely at the planning level, it's arguable, really. It's in the balance. But I think that there was so much pressure from the locals to turn it down that the planning committee certainly found it very difficult not to turn it down on something. And I think traffic was a serious issue at Ed's side. Noise was a kind of a little bit peripheral, and I think that probably the planning committee did make a wise decision in turning it down on noise and put the council in a very difficult position.
They're grateful for not being awarded cost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Time for one more. Any more? Please join me in thanking Andy and Ed. Just won't keep you too much longer. Once again, thank you for coming. Please make sure you've signed the attendance list at the back. Our next meeting is at Solent, joint with the AES on the 9th of March, the virtual singing studio. You should have seen the notice go out about that. As I said in the AGM, if you want to get involved, then send an email to myself or to David, and he can forward you the details. Please provide any feedback in the same way about this meeting or what you want from us in terms of future meetings. Those of you that are more astute and have read the entire notice will have noticed that we said we're going to go for a curry afterwards. I don't know whether having a drink first will be more appealing to some people, or whether that will stop them going for a curry. But if I have a show of hands for who wants to go for a drink first? Brilliant. And anybody staying for curry? Sounds good to me. Okay, so we'll go out the door on the left, picture and piano, and then across to the Gandhi for curry. Thank you for coming.
Dan, yes, well done, Dan.